Sasha Alenko here. I help write and produce the Reconnect America podcast. Crises in the U.S. railroad industry are never a question of if, but of when. The history of this critical national infrastructure has been defined from the start by the inherent tension between its public purpose and the private imperatives of the corporations that own and operate it. Since the federal government began regulating railroads 140 years ago, success in striking a balance between these interests has been more the exception than the rule. In the best of times, stasis has been imperfect and temporary. The 2 or 3 decades that followed railroad deregulation in 1980 are often characterized as one of these periods of relative stability. Railroad finances recovered from the danger zone they had found themselves in the 1960s and 70s, and the railroads managed to carry more and more of the nation's freight while charging their customers lower and lower rates on average. As we saw in episode 5 of our main series, this appearance of equilibrium always obscured the reality that these gains were built on the backs of smaller shippers and communities who got left behind by the deregulated railroad system or else were forced to accommodate themselves to it in costly ways. It wasn't until the 2010s, however, that many began to question the approach that the US had taken with deregulation. With the consolidation of the industry from 40 Class 1 railroads in 1979 to just 7 in 2000, and the subsequent arrival of an aggressive class of predatory investors intent on squeezing ever more profit out of the system, a far larger portion of the nation's shippers found themselves paying more money for worse and less frequent service, a situation which the regulatory system was poorly equipped to address. Primarily aimed at rescuing railroad corporations from the brink of collapse, deregulation had stripped the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, of many of the tools it had relied upon to steward the public interest, and the deregulatory zeitgeist had left the Commission with little interest in using those tools that remained. In 1996, in an effort to weaken the nation's regulatory capacity even further, the ICC was replaced by the Surface Transportation Board, or the STB, which was given fewer staff, fewer voting members, and far less independence. Unlike the ICC, it was placed within the Department of Transportation, and the president was given the ability to remove STB members at will. When a major service crisis in 2015 threatened to leave farmers in the Great Plains without access to rail transport, lawmakers saw how ineffectual the U.S. regulatory apparatus had become, and they decided to breathe some life back into it. They expanded the STB's authority, albeit only slightly, they added seats to the board, and they restored its independence, removing it from DOT control and from the possibility of arbitrary, capricious, or politically motivated removal of its members. At least, that was what the law said and what Congress intended. Over the next several years, as Wall Street pushed railroad corporations to take even greater advantage of their customers, many of whom had nowhere else to turn for transportation, the STB began to look for ways to hold the railroads accountable to their public purpose. In recent years, certain voices have come to the fore as strident advocates for upholding this social contract between America's railroads and the public they are meant to serve. One of those voices has been Robert Primus, who joined the STB in January of 2021 and served as its chair from May 2024 to January 2025. Last August, less than a month after Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern announced their intention to merge, Mr. Primus was fired without cause by President Trump. The one-line rationale that Mr. Primus failed to align with the president's America First agenda, aside from being completely spurious, also clearly falls short of the criteria of inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office that are legally required to justify such a removal. Solutionary Rail recognized this as a threat to the independence and legitimacy of the STB, and we pushed back, calling for a halt to board proceedings until Mr. Primus could be restored to his rightful position. Although this has not happened, and the independence of the board remains open to question, the fight continues, both through advocacy and legal channels. It is through these efforts that Solutionary Rail director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer came into contact with Mr. Primus, and we recently had the privilege of recording an interview with him. The conversation you're about to hear explores Mr. Primus's experience on the STB, the broader situation in which the board finds itself today, and the beginnings of a pathway forward. Here is Bill's conversation with former Surface Transportation Board Chair Robert Primus.
Chair Primus. That's what I really want to call you. I want to call you Chair Primus. But really, okay, Board Member Primus. Damn those suckers, man, for making it more difficult. Mr. Robert Primus.
I just wish my kids would actually call me chair or, that. Or, I get hey. That's all I get.
Right. What happened to sir? What happened to dad? I mean, dad's a pretty low bar.
Exactly.
Anyway, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know it's been a tumultuous year for you, and it's an honor to get to talk with you.
Well, no, I appreciate that. And Bill, I'll tell everyone out there, look, I stand on the shoulders of a lot of people who supported me. You are one of the bigger supporters. And, I appreciate everything that you've done over these past 8 months. It's been an upside down time, but at the same time, I've been very blessed to have the support and friendship of so many people, including yourself. So as crazy as it is, the ship is still upright. We're keeping trying to paddle in the right direction.
Yeah, not around, got to go through it.
That's right.
Yeah. So before we get into all of that, I think it would be nice to hear how you got into the position of being on the Surface Transportation Board, right, and what puts you into the running for that. And then why did you say yes?
Well, I got to be honest with you. It was not on my top 10 hit list. I'd spent roughly 25 years on Capitol Hill, public service. Now, I will say public service I love. And so any type of public service I'm always into. And Mike Capuano had recently, I've worked with him for 20 years, a great guy. He was ranking on the rail subcommittee on the House T&I committee. So having my exposure to rail through him, and also on the personal side, my family has deep roots within the railroad community. I can go back to probably the late 1800s, great grandparents, great grandfather, great uncles, and the like were all worked on the railroad. My grandfather worked on the railroad. Several members, actually, my great grandfather and great uncle gave their lives on the railroad. Really? So there's part of that personal passion that had been burning all along. But then the professional side, as I said, with Mike on TNI. So actually, unbeknownst to me, I had no idea that I was being considered until they came and approached me in late 2019 to ask me would I consider it. And when they first asked me, I said no, only because they caught me literally flat-footed and I just hadn't thought about it. And stepping into a regulatory role for me was something new, even though I said I enjoyed public service. So I took a step back. Actually, I talked to Capuano and he and I had a great conversation. And a couple other friends had made me realize that this could be a great opportunity for me to continue public service, but also in something that I really enjoy and I love. So luckily enough, Senator Schumer's people came back to me again and asked me would I reconsider, and I said yes. And so that began the journey. And President Trump at the time was taking a long time to consider me, to the point where I was going to withdraw my name because I thought it wasn't going to happen. But it did in the summer of 2020. And believe it or not, just to show how bipartisan it can be, at the time, Chairman Roger Wicker of the Senate Commerce Committee, his folks called me. And as soon as I was nominated, they're like, okay, well, your hearing's in 2 weeks.
Wow.
And I was like, wow. Yeah, that's what I said. and so did the staff on the board, because they were like, wow, we've never had to turn around that quick. And so they had to brief me in 2 weeks' time. The old murder boards where, you had 15 people yelling questions at you, asking you, do you know this? Do you know that? But we went in, and Wicker's staff couldn't have been any better. I mean, I'd known his staff director for a while, great guy. And, the hearing went very well. And, I had a couple of benefactors on the committee. I mean, Tammy Baldwin, Senator Baldwin, she's great. I've known her since her House days, and she couldn't have been any supportive. But I had support on both sides. Capito from West Virginia, also Blunt, in addition to Wicker. So sailed through, unanimous vote on the floor as well. And I was sworn in, believe it or not. It was a sort of a ceremonial swearing in. I had to officially go in and sign the next day, but I was ceremonial sworn in by Jim Clyburn at the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. What? Yep, around 11 o'clock. So literally, about 3 or so hours before all hell broke loose.
Oh, my goodness.
So how's that for a kickoff? So being there since 2021, jumping in right at the time of the service meltdowns and everything happening post-COVID, it was a perfect time for me to get there, because I think there's a lot going on. And I believe that my contribution was important.
Yeah, it was important. And I'll tell you, I was just learning about Surface Transportation Board and its role. And it was during those service interruption hearings. A lot of folks were participating remotely. I think you were remote for that
I was.
17-hour marathon session. Oh my God, that was intense.
We should have gone longer, honestly. I mean, I was home because my wife had COVID. My youngest son had a stomach bug. And so I had to keep them apart while taking care of them at the same time. But I say it should have been longer because I think even though we heard from many voices, I think we still did not hear from everyone that we need to hear. Of course, everyone remembers the confrontation I had with Jim Foote, but I certainly would have wished that every other Class 1 CEO would have shown up and been accountable for their service failures as well, and what they were doing to shippers and what they were doing to, at the time, the economy and the supply chain.
Well, I have to say that you made a big impression on me when I was
Thank you.
listening, in that I felt like you were unafraid to ask the difficult questions. And in these beltway type environments, it seems like unless people are just trying to score points politically, it doesn't feel like the corporations are asked the tough questions. And in the context of the Surface Transportation Board, I almost feel like that's more of an issue. And so it was a real relief to hear you speak with such moral clarity. And I think it's that penchant for fairness is something that I feel is a great virtue that you carry with you in your work. So I just want to note you made an impression to me and lots of people.
I appreciate that, Bill. I mean, ironically, that fair and balance comes from being a kid stuck in the middle. I have the middle kid syndrome, if you will. And so I've always tried to look at things being fair and balanced. But coming to the board, believe it or not, the greatest thrill for me was the independence. You know, you go back to saying not afraid to ask questions. Well, I think it was our right as independent board members to get to the bottom of it. I told people then, and I'll tell you now, I wasn't looking for a job when I came to the board. I wasn't looking for trying to score points with someone so someone would hire me afterwards. That wasn't my job while I was there. My mission, honestly, was to promote the health and well-being of our national freight rail network. And if that meant I had to ask the questions I asked, so be it. It would be a disservice to the network, to shippers, to the railroads, to rail labor, and to anyone else who has interest if I didn't ask those questions.
Yeah, it was your early time on the board. Was there a learning curve? I mean, there's just so much to this industry. What was it like to kind of grow in your own sense? Maybe you had it already, of how critical this industry is for our country.
I would say from day one, because of the service crisis that we were in, I knew how critical it was. I knew it was critical. I did not realize how deep it went. With respect to learning curve, tremendous learning curve. As I said before, we did legislation, policy. Regulating is different. So having to learn the different regulatory measures, understanding what we did on a daily basis. Things are very complex. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to be one. But the idea of regulatory is mostly law and legal. We're surrounded by either lawyers or we're surrounded by economists. So, we're damned on either side. But the reality is for me is that I knew that I had a style and I had a way of understanding things that were complex, being able to break them down and put them back together so I could understand and move through. And we had a particular case that they walked me through. I think it was maybe my second or third week. And they said it was the most difficult case that they had. And no one seemed to understand it. And so they walked me through. And after about 45 minutes, I regurgitated back to them the way I heard it. And they were pretty much, yeah, that was it. And so that was my light bulb moment saying, yes, it's difficult, but I can do this. We can figure it out. It's not impossible. And I've started taking that thought throughout my professional career. I mean, in college, my degree was in marketing. My minor was in graphic design and advertising. So about as far away from government as you can get, yet I had a successful career on Capitol Hill. I think it's being able to adapt to your situation. I didn't come in as an expert. I'm not an expert, but I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to sit down and figure it out. I think that's what helped.
You're willing to learn. And if you're not willing to learn, then, I mean, there's no point. we've got to be willing to learn because we're here to solve problems. And we can't solve problems if we're not willing to listen to the impacts. And yeah. So at what point was the decision around the Canadian Pacific, Kansas City Southern? What was your role on the board when that was being decided?
So I was a board member. I wasn't chairman. Marty Oberman was chairman. It was a tough decision. I think I made the right decision, even though I was the only one to vote against the merger. There are many things that I can point out. I think the first one that I had the biggest difficulty with was that we considered it under the old rules. And they did so because there was a provision in the rules that said, oh, if Kansas City is so small that if they're merging with someone else, they don't have to. Now, the board could decide to, but they don't have to decide it under the new rules. And I thought that was a big mistake. I think the fact that we are in a new paradigm in terms of our network, I think that these railroads are all extremely strong in terms of capable, in terms of money making, financially, that this would have been the perfect test case for us to see whether or not the new rules applied and how they applied and how we could do it. I think Marty did a fantastic job under the old rules. And we definitely took our time to assess what was going on. It took 16 months. But I think even with all that, it was still missing because we still didn't answer those two questions. Was it in the public interest and did it advance competition? Now, it remains to be seen whether or not they do, but I think we missed our opportunity. And I think it was on a bogus call in terms of the provision that was put in. And even Congress in its past has questioned that. Both Republicans and Democrats questioned that provision as to that carve out for KCS. You know, what's good for them should have been good for everybody else.
Right. And is there anything you'd like to say more about that decision? I mean, it must have been challenging as a relatively new member to the board. You're holding your ground alone in the opposition to the merger. Anything else you'd like to say or share about that process? Or
it was not difficult. It wasn't difficult for me. It wasn't difficult being the lone no vote. It wasn't difficult stating my opposition. It wasn't difficult challenging some of the viewpoints because that was my job. My job was not to go along to get along. My job was not to be partisan. So, you know, it didn't matter that Marty was the chairman and a Democrat. It didn't matter that Biden was in the White House and was a Democrat and they didn't have any formal opposition to the merger. It didn't matter, again, that I would be the only one. We were independent regulators. And so my job was to be independent, to think independently, to look at the facts in a transparent way and deliver the message, deliver what I believe should have happened. And so I'm sure people would think, oh, there was a lot of arm twisting. And it wasn't. It really wasn't. As a matter of fact, I went to Marty before they started polling and told him I was against it. I said, you can save it all for later. This is where I am. This is where I'm coming from. And he was surprised. And I think others were surprised too that I came out so early. But again, I wasn't trying to hide anything. I wasn't trying to play gotcha. I wasn't trying to play a political game. I was just trying to play it as I saw it.
Sasha was just sent me a message. What was the state of the industry at the time and how did the merger affect that?
We were just coming out of the service meltdowns post-COVID. Everyone was suffering. We were having embargoes around the country. Union Pacific had embargoed a large part of their network in the Midwest. The NSF was embargoing companies in California. You had issues with polar vortexes. So there was a lot of headache going on. And the idea for me was, okay, at the same time, it was clear that competition between the railroads really didn't exist. I mean, we had duopolies. We had a duopoly in the East, we had a duopoly in the West, and we had a duopoly in Canada. You know, Kansas City Southern kind of had their own groove, I mean, because of their stake in Mexico and their access to Mexico. But it wasn't necessarily, you saw them like you see the airlines, see other people cutting rates or, you know, really hunting after people. They coalesced around their captive shippers. They went after some shippers that were open to both. But for the most part, it was you control your kingdom, I control mine. We'll fight in little small spots, but it's not the type of competition that people think competition should be.
This brings me back to thinking about the Staggers Act and
Right.
the problems that the Staggers Act was solving. are pretty much they don't exist anymore. So we're still using the Staggers Act to solve problems that actually, we have a whole new set of problems now.
You have a whole new network now. And I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, you're looking at the Staggers. So I like to make it plain for folks who may not have followed it. When Staggers came in 1980, we had 40 class ones that, for most of them, were close to going under, close to bankruptcy, suffering, growth. And a lot of it was due to, at the time, an ICC that was stuck and was not forward looking. And so, considering the Penn Central failure, considering Conrail, considering Amtrak, all those things that were at the point of hemorrhaging, just like a patient that's dying, we had to give them something to help strengthen them and bring them back. So, the best analogy I tell people is that when you've got a patient that's sick and very sick and maybe, on its deathbed, we give them a prescribed steroids to strengthen their body and build them up and get them back whole on their feet again. That's sort of what Staggers did. Staggers said, okay, we're going to remove a lot of this regulatory burden. We're going to allow for railroads to consolidate and to do some of the things that they couldn't do before to get them back on their feet. It worked. And they started consolidating, they started getting stronger and stronger. But just like steroids can be used to revive people and be a positive force, it can also be an extremely destructive and negative force. I think Lyle Alzado, former football player who went that route, ended up with brain cancer and passed away a while ago. But you get to that point where those steroids now damage the body. They harm the body and it becomes abusive. And that's exactly what happened. The rush to consolidate, which people in the late 90s saw as destructive, so much so that Congress raised alarm and the ICC, then the STB, answered by putting a moratorium on mergers. And not only did they put a moratorium on the mergers, they changed the rules of how they were going to process and review mergers, which is where we are today. But at the same time,
feels like they were too late in a way.
It was a partial healing because the other part of the healing should have been going back to revisit Staggers and whether or not we needed to not go back to the way it was before Staggers, but where we fine-tune Staggers. So again, it's not, okay, you can have all the steroids you want now in this way. No, it's about going back and saying, okay, well, you're healthy now. Let's dial back on the steroids and on the care you're receiving because you don't need it anymore. But let's also put some guardrails up to keep you healthy in a responsible way.
Yeah.
And so that's the idea for moving now, is that we need Congress. And one of the things that you and I had talked about in the past is the STB broken. I don't think it's necessarily broken in the sense that it does its job, what it's asked to do. But it is broken in a sense that it should be doing more and does not have the ability to do more. And I think one of the things that will allow it is for a robust reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Board, but also a revisit to Staggers to re-examine, what are some of the things that we need to look at that would make the network healthier and stronger, but less abusive and less damaging from where it is now. And I think that's the problem. Again, you can look at private equity as part of the problem, but you also have to look at the idea of PSR. You have to look at the idea that they can raise rates. And our rate system at the STB is broken. It is cumbersome. It takes forever. And it is proven to not really be reliable or valuable to the shipper.
Yeah, I mean, what we've heard from shippers thus far is I'm trying to figure out how many shippers are actually using the published tariff rates, because it seems like even the non-exempted commodity shippers, they're still favoring contract rates, or they're in the contract rates because
they're forced into a lot of these contract rates because, again, the railroads being the duopolies that they are, or monopolies within their areas that they are, it's my way or the highway.
Yeah.
And so you begin to get forced into these contracts and forced into these positions where the shippers really don't have as much power. I don't want to say power because it's a shared responsibility, but they don't have as much at the table, bargaining ability at the table than people think.
Well, I think it's fair to say that they don't have much power. I think that's totally a legitimate thing to say when they are forced into accepting my way or the highway. And that could be literally like by demarketing them for those who have the choice. But the folks that actually have tariff rates are the commodities that don't have a choice of using trucks, like coal or oil or wheat, but they're still captive shippers.
Right.
So when you were chair and you called for the hearing on growth,
Yes.
again, I was struck by your sense of fairness. You, I feel like, had to kind of take a slightly different tone and role in that position. So maybe you could speak to a little bit of the transition from being a member to being the chair and why you called that hearing on growth.
Well, I mean, the number one difference is I got to control the agenda. And I'll say this also. I knew that I had a limited window because of the election. So there are things that I wanted to do that I knew would go beyond the election. And so it could become a less of futility if the election did not go the way I wanted to. And so I chose to focus on the things I could and get some of the things I could get done. And I think one of the biggest things for me was that hearing on growth, because even during the service hearings, there was conversation about, we need to grow. The network needs to grow, and shippers are leaving. Those who leave and go to truck don't come back. Well, how do we respond? How do we make the network something that people want to be a part of? Our national freight rail network is the most efficient, is the safest, most economical mode of freight movement that you can have in this country. And yet you have shippers who are leaving by the dozens and turning to truck and others because of the service problem and because of reliability. I mean, it's part of service, but it's also, I would say, the treatment of railroads. And that's why I didn't necessarily say power, because I think the railroads exert a tremendous amount of power right now instead of being partners and coming to the table to negotiate and to work deals out. I've said it before that the short line world is a perfect example of what our national freight rail network could be because of how they treat their customers, because of how they look at service, because of how they look at reliability and their commitment to quality. The white glove service that we hear so many shippers rave about when they're served by short lines. Yes, the big guys probably can't do that type of service for every customer, but they can be more customer centric and customer oriented and service focused. That would not only retain the shippers we have, but also bring considerably more shippers away from trucking and put them back on rail. And so that's one of the things that, from a timing standpoint, and why I wanted the growth hearing, is because it's so important. We talk about growing the economy and now the whole talk of manufacturing and all the other things that we're doing. Well, that will never happen if we do not have a robust and strong and reliable and efficient freight rail network. I don't know any manufacturer who's going to come into this country and rebuild and want to have 5-day-a-week service, and you're going to have the railroads tell you, no, we're going to have 3 days a week. And we can't pick you up when you want to. We'll pick you up when we're ready.
And we're going to charge you demurrage fees when we dump a bunch of stuff all at once.
Right. And we don't redress the mistakes that we made. So if we lose your cars, if we're late, if something happens that's our fault and they don't get delivered when they're supposed to get delivered, there's no redress. And I think there's a huge problem. That's one of the things, if anything, that I'd love the Congress to give the STB the power to address those issues. I mean, CPKC melted down last year when they tried to change over their network. It caused a tremendous burden for our chemical shippers, our oil and gas folks, all those guys down in the Louisiana area and the Gulf area, tens of millions of dollars lost. But yet no one received a penny of that. No one received any sort of compensation for their failure, except for we're sorry and we won't do it again, but we're going to raise your rates.
Right. And it seems to me that's another sign that the system is broken, that something's not working. It feels suspiciously like the Surface Transportation Board is a bit of a pressure valve when you release the steam, when there's anger and you call all the people that come to be questioned, like a scolding. It's like Congress says that too. And without actual consequences, actual accountability, it feels like an exercise in managing people's outrage and frustration rather than solving the problem. Is that unfair?
No, I don't think so. Since I was at the board, I would say from 2021, the service hearing was a way, you're right, pressure release. But we did get, at the same time, there is still that respect to a certain level for the STB from the railroads. And so we do get certain responses. We are able to get things moving. It may not be moving as quickly as we want them to, but generally they do move in the right direction. But I think it is fair to say that there's a lot of things that we should be moving more on and we should have more authority to do, and that the railroads should respect us on. I mean, I'll just give you a perfect example that you brought up, demurrage. I mean, under Ann Begeman, who I think was a great chair, she brought up demurrage and they passed a rulemaking on demurrage to make it more difficult for the railroads to arbitrarily slap demurrage on people. Since that rule has been in place, we have not had a hearing or anything public to understand whether or not it actually is working. And to me, that's part of the oversight, that if you do something, you have to be able to come back and look at it and say, is it working or not? Going back to the same thing with the staggers. That's why I want to revisit staggers. Congress never went back and said, okay, is it still relevant? Is it still necessary? Should it be tweaked? Same thing that we should be doing with demurrage. Is it working? If it's not working, what needs to happen? Should we do more? How do we do it? You don't just pass something and think, oh, it's been perfect. We're just going to leave it as it is and go on our way. It doesn't work that way. Never has worked that way. The Constitution has not worked that way. We were tinkering, amending, doing everything we can with that. So why wouldn't we do it to a decision?
Right. So if the companies are healthy and rates are going down and service is going up, and then it pivots where the service is getting worse and the rates are going up, that would have been a really great time to start saying, hey, did we just run out of line with the staggers thing?
Right.
We have to revisit this. And I want to also note that one of the moments that stood out to me in the service hearing was when the short lines were sitting at the table and you invited them to speak, or someone asked them the question of, how's it going with the class ones? And I was in the back room. I felt like I giggled, I was like, they can't even answer that question. Why are we asking that question when they can't actually answer it? And they hemmed and hawed a little bit. They said something about, we don't, like to comment on things that are outside our control or something like that. Right. And that brings me to this asymmetrical power relationship between the railroads and the shippers, the railroads and the short lines, the railroads and labor, and the question of retaliation. Does the Surface Transportation Board have within its power the mechanisms to protect shippers and short lines and others, those two in particular, from retaliation if they tell the truth to the regulators?
Do they have the power? Yes. Do they exercise that power? No. This is an issue that from literally the first few weeks I've been there, I recognized that there was an issue there. During my time as chair, I tried to get a non-binding policy statement that basically said the board acknowledged that there was a problem, that it hindered our ability to do our job because people were not willing to come and tell us about what was going on and what was wrong. During the service hearings, you saw we had almost no individual shippers come and talk to us. During the growth hearing, I had almost no individual shippers come and talk to us. You will see it during the merger. You will not have individual shippers, it will be very small, who are willing to stand up and say they are against the merger. And that is because they fear there'll be some sort of retaliation on them by Union Pacific. And groups in the past have feared that there would be some sort of retaliation by other class ones. And I heard it. I heard it from shippers. I've heard it from the short lines. I've heard from labor. It's out there and it's true. And it's disappointing to me. It's one of the most disappointing things that I encountered during my time on the board when the other board members would not agree to a non-binding policy statement on intimidation and retaliation. That told me that we're fooling ourselves and we're only acting at what we're supposed to be doing. Because if we're not willing to put out a non-binding statement, then that means we're not willing to even acknowledge or even address the issue. Now, in my non-binding statement, I did say if credible information comes that we believe shows that there's intimidation or retaliation, that we would refer that to the Justice Department. And I think, again, to actually say that, the board has never said that publicly. We may not be acting every day, but if we send a message that we're willing to act, to do something, that wakes up enough people. But as long as you don't say anything, hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. That's the thing right now that bothers me the most is we all know anybody who's involved with railroading today in this country knows that intimidation is real, retaliation is real, and it does affect the network. And when I spoke at Mars in January of 2025, right before I was removed as chairman, and I said that in my speech, that it was real. I got a very positive response from people in the room. Of course, it was all privately, no one publicly, but they all acknowledged that, yes, it's out there.
Right.
And it's real.
And if you can't have the major stakeholders honestly participate in the regulatory process to give testimony about their experience, then what good is that process? Honestly, like it's theater. It diminishes its relevance and its legitimacy. And it's a huge problem. And if the STB won't solve it, then is it Congress? Does Congress step in to do that?
Well, Congress should give the STB greater authority to enforce it.
Yeah.
And to do something about it. Again, that's why I said before that part of giving the STB sharper teeth would be for Congress to reauthorize us with these problems in mind. We have an overly cumbersome rate resolution. We can't see how to address captive shippers who don't have true rate relief. Should we be allowed to step in and deliver that? Intimidation, retaliation, should we be stronger in how we deal with that? Common carrier obligation, how we go after common carrier, how we redress major service problems that cost shippers millions of dollars. The STB/ICC has not given out fines in decades. You hear about the FCC, something happened. Oh, we're going to fine you. You hear about the SEC, there's a violation in Wall Street. We're going to fine you. You heard the FTC. Oh, we're going to fine you. The STB, somebody screws up, somebody does something wrong. Well, just don't do it again.
Right.
That's it. Or if you do it again, okay, we're going to ask you not to do it again. We never get to the point of slapping someone down and saying, okay, you did it wrong. You have to pay the piper. You have to pay the penalty. I mean, it's ridiculous that we have not, the original penalties that were set in 1887 were not even increased through inflation until the 2010s. And that was because by law we were supposed to do it. And we realized we were breaking the law. A $10,000 fine to a railroad in 1887 was probably the equivalent of today of $250,000. A $10,000 fine today is a $10,000 fine to a $1 billion plus company.
It's a cost of doing business. It's nothing.
That's not even a cost of doing it. That's not even a quarter of the interest for a second of what they're making. I mean, so the idea that we don't have the authority to impose stiff penalties. Perfect example. Union Pacific literally was causing foster farms in California to at the point of euthanizing chickens and poultry because they were not getting feed. A severe problem.
Yeah.
Falling down on the job. And so, but we couldn't say, okay, if you don't do it, we're going to slap a $5 million fine on you. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And so they get to do what they get to do. Yes, we emergency orders and we, do this way. But the idea of not having monetary penalties and not being able to enforce those, that tells you, like I said, we're operating in so many ways, but we're broken in so many others.
Does the STB have the capacity to issue those fines and just chooses not to? Or do they not have the capacity to issue those fines and enforce them?
Oh, we have fines. I mean, every year we vote on that increase I said over for the fines and penalties. And every year that I was on the board, I put a statement in there saying this is a joke, that we raise them, but we don't do anything with them. And these fines are really, they don't match the scale of the railroads today. Again, what's a $10,000 fine to a company that makes billions of dollars quarterly? That's nothing. That's not even someone's bonus check.
Yeah. So when I got to speak with you, which I thought was funny, because you said when you called on me, I swear, when I listened to the video, it's like, Moyer. And I felt like I should have said, yeah, coach. Like, but anyway, love that opportunity. That was the first time I'd ever had that opportunity. And it was really meaningful to get to participate. And one of the things that was important for me to recognize was that the failure of providing service and the demarketing of trucks is costing the public already. And the growth, well, a couple of things. One, that growth for my environmental justice allies who live around rail yards, growth without cleaning up the freight system's emissions is a death warrant for people who live in the area. And that's why it's hard for me to separate electrification from mode shift to rail, which I'm a big fan of mode shift to rail, but I see the other side of it. But when I spoke to the board, my thought was, well, can you expand the reciprocal switching considerations to exempt commodities as well as non-exempt? Can we revoke the exemptions that keep people from being able
to
exercise their common carrier obligation? And what is the meaning of common carrier obligation if there's no standard of service? And why would we have a standard of service that's only for some commodities, but not for everybody?
Right.
It seems like this is where staggers is just like, done. We're done.
This is where Congress has to play a role in the STB, 2.0, 3.0, wherever you think we are. We talked about Senator Baldwin. She's got a great bill out, bipartisan bill that addresses a lot of that with common carrier, competitive access, all these things that we have been stuck on and in some respects unable to do, and in other respects unwilling to do. I think Congress needs to sort of light that fire and give us that direction to say, okay, we created you for a reason. You're there for a reason. So we need you to do your job. And yes, we are technically doing our job by approving abandonments and dealing with the enforcement of certain agreements and others. Yes, we do all that on a daily basis. But it's the bigger things, the bigger picture, the things that will impact the network the greatest that I think we still need to work on. We need a kick in the butt to get us moving.
Yeah. So the Reliable Rail Service Act is, I believe, what you're referring to. And that is a piece of legislation that we've also been championing. And I know that the rail shippers champion. But again, they can't champion it publicly. Similarly, even though they championed the Rail Safety Act the last time it came up, now the Association of American Railroads has told rail shippers to not champion that. Again, so it's about the threat of retaliation. So it seems like you are indicating that there is a role for the Department of Justice.
It's a smaller role. We can't prosecute, like for the intimidation or retaliation, we can't prosecute. Their task and their mission is to prosecute. So that precludes us from saying, okay, we're going to go after, because again, if it's criminal, we don't deal with criminal at the STB. And so, yes, we can impose fines, but those fines aren't because of something done in a criminal manner. Intimidation and retaliation, I think, goes beyond just the basic rail shipper or labor issue. It's against the law.
Right.
And so that's something different where I think DOJ would have to have that role.
But some people would like to wipe out the STB, it seems like, and dump the antitrust stuff to the Department of Justice. I mean, maybe I'm just overstating that, but
that's everybody who works at DOJ.
Okay. Because that'd be a shame, because they aren't responsible for shaping the system. And, we were tracing the history of the ICC, and there was at one point in its history where it was supposed to basically shape the system by managing the consolidation in a way that creates a better system. And then they were relieved of that mandate, but they still could have done it and they didn't do it.
Well, it goes back to even World War I, where the government took over the railroads and utilized them. We gave them back, but there was also an effort of saying, hey, we may be on to something. Let's look at how we do that. And there was an effort, but it never got to something more serious. I'll say this, though we've always been seen as independent, the ICC or the STB, I mean, even the ICC at one point, it wasn't really as independent as people think independent agencies should. I mean, there was a time when they listened to Congress. Congress told them to do something, they did it even without legislation, or how it was padded during previous administrations back when you had probably a dozen or so members on there and all the committees. Again, people don't realize that the ICC, before it was turned into the STB, had well over 2,000 employees. I mean, it was a huge agency. Now they're supposed to have 5 members, and I think they just barely have 120 people. I mean, that's a lot to carry for an agency that has such a responsibility. I think we've got to recognize that. I mean, you look at it as it compares to the SEC, the FTC, and others, and we definitely need to get, again, reauthorized and allowed to get to a level where we can handle the workload that is required of us.
Yeah. And a relook at national rail policy to evaluate how is the public interest best served by this critical national infrastructure seems to be in direct conflict with the system that we find ourselves in, where a minority holding like Ancora that can have as little as 0.02% of the shares of CSX can cause the ousting of the CEO, or can turn over board members at Norfolk Southern. People talk about investing in growth, anything other than short-term profit maximization and shareholder earnings, shareholder value, stock buybacks. If anybody talks about anything other than that, increasing service, those 5 trips a day to your critical industry, if people talk about improving service or even attracting freight back to the rails, God forbid, electrification or buying even cleaner diesel locomotives, they could be ousted immediately. So does the Surface Transportation Board have a role to play, or what is Congress's role when it comes to the influence of private equity and their control over even the C-suite of these Class 1 railroads?
Well, I mean, that's a $25,000 question. How do we do it? Is there a problem? Absolutely, there's a problem. Which one of the things that drove, well, Hunter Harrison may have thought PSR was one thing, but private equity has taken it and exploited it for another. It's one of the reasons why the railroads are in the condition that they're in now, which is financially they're fantastic in terms of service and reliability. It's kind of sad that Senator Baldwin has to name her bill reliable rail service, because that doesn't exist in a world of private equity. It's not a matter of whether or not you get reliable service. It's whether or not you come in under the operating ratio they set and you hit the profit bar where that's set. That's why you've seen service go down. That's why you see there's no growth. But at the same time, rates have gone up and the profitability of railroads has skyrocketed. And there's something wrong with that. There's an imbalance, going back to what we said before. There's an extreme imbalance there. I don't mind the railroads making money. I hope they're extremely successful, but you've got to do it the right way. You've got to do it by providing that service and by growing. It's sort of like the Little Shop of Horrors, the sort of the Feed Me Seymour thing, where in the beginning it's cute. The plan is, it fits on your table and it eats bugs and anything like that. But when it starts getting out of control, when it gets bigger and it engulfs your house and you're sacrificing things that you never thought you would sacrifice for its livelihood, and it's damaging you and everything around you at the same time, is that truly what we want? Is that truly the type of network that we want? Because then you get to the economic term, I'll say, is that, the law of diminishing returns, when we realize the error of our ways and that we're not the most efficient and effective supply chain, and we are causing prices to go up and we have problems, all the money you put into it will not solve it because the system literally now is too broke to fix. And so what you put in, you'll get less out of because there's a point where no matter what you do, shippers will not come back to the network. And so what's lost is lost. I was up in Minnesota with the CEO of Twin Cities Western short line. We were out driving a few hours outside of Minneapolis, and he was like, yeah, there's a company here who the class ones really did bad to, and they pulled up stakes back in the 90s, and I cannot convince them to ever go back to rail because of what happened 30 plus years ago. And you hear that story over and over again and over and over. And so you quickly realize that in some respects, freight rail is subsidizing trucking because as much as they're on the ropes, we are throwing them business because of the lack of service and reliability that we have on our line. And so people are saying, well, if I can't get picked up 5 days a week, if I can't get reliable service, I will turn to truck. And those that can do, and they very rarely come back.
And let's be real, it's the public ultimately who's subsidizing the mode of the truck, right? The congestion, the emissions, the public health, diesel emissions, the wear and tear on the infrastructure, the vehicle safety.
That's why I find it funny when AAR and others talk about, oh, subsidizing trucks and trucking, and this is the competition. I'm like, we subsidize that. Railroads do because of the lack of service and what we're losing. I mean, there's been data that shows over the past decade that the trucking increases have happened because people have left freight rail. They don't leave freight rail because somehow trucking is better. They're not better. They're better because we're bad and because we're not giving the customer what the customer needs. Not saying it has to be perfect, but at least give the customers, options like IT, telematics, all these things that, you can know from Amazon or from Domino's Pizza where your pizza is down to the block. But somehow the railroads won't allow telematics on there so you can know where your rail car is, what the health of the rail car is, when it's going to be delivered, all these things. Somehow we're at 2026 and we have no clue, but everybody else does.
Right.
Everyone else
that would
does.
cost money. That would cost money. That would actually require investment. That would require investment in service. That would require investment in the infrastructure, in the labor.
But they're broke, so they can't afford it. After giving $3 billion back to buybacks to shareholders, what do you have left? Right. So, that's a tough thing to solve.
And speaking of subsidizing, I would say that it's the public that is subsidizing those share buybacks because we're paying for the failure of the railroads to provide service with all of those things that are external costs to the shipping process. And here we are at the endgame moment of consolidation when they're going to try to squeeze yet more out and still do less. And we still haven't solved the problem that Staggers has failed to solve.
They don't want to solve it. I mean, the idea is, in their minds, why fix something that's not broken?
Yeah, in their minds, not broken. The definition of working that they have is quite different than the definition of working that I have as a public interest advocate.
Well, not just you as a public interest, but as shippers and as an end user, as a consumer. The idea that somehow what they do does not have an effect on the national economy, on prices, on people's wallets is ridiculous. That was proven during the service crisis. The largest mill in the country, because of the service debacle that was happening, it was costing them $1 a bushel to process. People think that's not a lot. But when you're processing millions of bushels a day, $1 per becomes a lot of money. And they don't pay that. They pass that along to their customer, who then passes along to the consumer. And so when we were paying more for bread and cookies and cereal, flour, all these other things, we're thinking, oh, it's just inflation. Oh, it's the supply chain.
Yeah.
But most people don't interact with freight railroads, so you don't understand it. You blame Giant or Safeway. You blame a major supermarket for raising rates. You blame the brand for raising rates for their product, not understanding that they may be doing it as a result that their transportation costs are going through the roof.
Right.
And there's nothing they can do about it.
They're a price taker. They're not a price maker when it comes to that.
In some respects, yes.
Yeah, in some respects.
I'll let all of them off the table, but for some of them, that's true.
it's a factor, and it's a factor that we are paying for in so many ways. So we're stuck with a regulatory system that's solving problems that no longer exist, a process that lacks transparency or the capacity to be equitable and reflective of the actual realities because the stakeholders can't participate honestly. We thought we had an independent board, the regulatory board of the Surface Transportation Board and these other independent boards. And now we don't even have that because we've got a president who will illegally fire a member of a board without cause, yourself, obviously, and others have been victims of that similar violation of our trust. And I know you have a lot to say, I'm sure, about that independence because nobody has experienced that more directly than yourself and those other few people who've been removed. So it would be weird to have this conversation and not talk about the illegal firing of Robert Primus from the Surface Transportation Board. Okay. And I want you to talk about it in whatever way you want to talk about that. But as I witness you, as someone who really cares about putting America first, as someone who cares about the economy, who's bringing in fairness, it seems like if even this regulatory board that lacks some teeth can't actually be trusted to be independent, we're in a shitload of trouble in terms of not being able to take on the forces that are mining, extracting, pilfering short-term profits from this critical national infrastructure. So however you want to go into that, the independence of the Surface Transportation Board, what would you say about the independence of the Surface Transportation Board?
Well, based on what, yeah, I know. Based on what happened to me and not just the board, but any independent board or agency, I think this country's in trouble. I really do. I mean, even though I said that the board, in some ways, it's broken in terms of how we're not looking at certain ideas. I mean, it would really be beyond repair if it became a biased entity. If we were sort of that, okay, well, we can be influenced by not just the facts of a case, not the circumstances, not what was put in front of us, but what we feel, what we're told to feel on a case. I mean, that becomes extremely dangerous because it's whomever is in the White House controls the board. And so whether or not you're controlling how a merger gets processed, whether or not you're controlling trackage rights, whether or not you're controlling rates, whether or not you're controlling a wide variety of things that should not be controlled by any administration, that should be looked upon in an independent, transparent, and wholly level playing field. I think we're on our way to a place where no one wants to be. And what it does to the board, it makes it into this crazy pendulum that now, depending on the administration, we will swing hard to one way and then hard to the other, which means that no railroad, no shipper, or anyone will have any sort of consistency in the board or any sort of reliability that we will be doing things solely based on the merit of the application or the issue that's in front of us. And that, to me, like I said, I came to the board, honestly, once I got there, I relished the fact that I could be independent. You know, I used to tell people that I have no boss. Even the president, who is the boss of us all, is required not to interfere with our work, which allows me ultimate independence and ultimate balance and transparency in what I do. And I think people then can trust what I do. When people looked at my vote, they didn't say, oh, it's Primus. He voted because he's a Democrat. When I was at the board, the thing that made me most proud is people said, well, he voted because that's how he saw it. And that's exactly how every member should make that. And I think right now we've had members who do not follow that. And I will say this, had I been chairman of the board and been asked to make certain decisions that have been made, I would have either resigned or stepped down because I would have made those decisions because of the fact that we are an independent board and we need to be treated like an independent board. For everything that we don't do, the network still operates in a way because of our independence. They listen because of our independence. They don't run to Congress first when they have a rule change, and they don't run to the White House first. They come to us. If that changes, then there really is no need for us. If we're being told what to do, if they go around us and think, well, we won't go to the STB, we'll just go to the White House or we'll go to Congress and they'll tell them what to do. And that's where they'll get removed. And that's the way it's going to be. Well, then we're literally down that rabbit hole and it's not going to be pretty at what the result will be.
Yeah, so it seems like we've got this almost a trifecta of the board's legitimacy has been put in jeopardy and is now in question. That's a done deal unless the courts find otherwise with your case.
Right. But no matter what, sorry to interrupt, but no matter what the current chairman, Patrick, says, it'll always be tainted because of that. I mean, no matter what they say that they're operating a certain way. I mean, even to the point where it was revealed a few months ago that when the government was shut down, he sent an internal memo, not once, but several times, blaming the Democrats. Now, he may have did it because the White House told him to do it, but that's the key thing. The White House told him to do something that was partisan, that an independent agency should not be a part of.
Right. He risked violating the Hatch Act.
I think he violated the Hatch Act. Now, whether or not
be held accountable for it, no,
right.
Probably not. But that's instead of standing up for the independence of the agency, he didn't have the backbone to do that. I'm sorry. You know, I've met the guy. I know he's like relatively reasonable and deal to talk with, et cetera. But at a certain point, you need to stop being a nice guy and you need to actually call it as it is and say, this is not okay. This is beyond the pale. And he really failed the integrity test at a critical moment, which kind of erased a lot of my other good impressions about the guy. And that's too bad. It's too bad because the whole nation suffers because of that. And now we're facing these gigantic questions. It's corrosive. It's corrosive of the public trust, and all of those who are subject to the regulations of this board are dependent upon. Okay, so you got the independence threatened. We've already talked about how the Staggers Act needs to be revisited. It hasn't. We're about 22 years late on that. So the Surface Transportation Board potentially either isn't using all the tools it has, the authority it has, like to give fines, to issue even the intent of standing up to retaliation or suspected retaliation or intimidation. The rules as written are very vague in terms of common carrier obligation. We don't even know who that applies to. The processes for challenging rates are unused because they're too onerous, and it's not getting better. Nobody knows how to reel back power from private equity over this infrastructure. Even the railroads themselves don't know how to do that. I hear people talking about, like smart people saying, oh, we don't want the government to get involved in regulation. But I'm like, where's the government? I don't see the government involved. I see these like almost as play acting as if the government's involved. And really, I think Wall Street's the one who's running the show. So it seems like, I mean, am I wrong to think we're at a critical moment, a kind of crossroads where we either kiss this thing goodbye and let it be just a resource that Wall Street extracts until it dies? Or do we need a paradigm shift in how we approach railroads in the US?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious where I stand. I mean, I think you do need a paradigm shift. I think you're right in a sense that it's operating successfully for some, but not for all. And, you know, who it's operating successfully for is not the intended recipient in the end. I mean, I think railroading was supposed to be something that benefited our national commerce, our manufacturers, our growers, American shippers, and ultimately benefited consumers because they had access to the products that were being shipped. Then you look at the benefit of course, rail labor and what it does and the jobs it creates. And where it is today, the only group that I think benefits is Wall Street. And Wall Street really has no interest in shippers or consumers. And again, I'm sure there'll be some shippers and other people will say they do fine and are served fine. But I think, and I should include those like the class twos and threes, the short lines that could also grow if they had the ability to have greater access or greater partnerships with the class ones. Again, I'm not saying that we need to come down on the class ones where all of a sudden their profits go dry because we tell them what you have to do, all these regulatory issues and these means. But I do think if they understand that there is an imbalance in the system now, and if we can work to correct the balance and promote growth, and not just growth over a quarter or over a year, but long-term sustained growth where the network is able to benefit. I mean, these guys are living off the fumes of intermodal. Well, I think we pretty much tapped out intermodal. We've already established the fact that this country has moved away from manufacturing and doing a lot of things in-house, so we get a lot of it from overseas. So yes, that intermodal is there. It's not going away, but it's also not going to grow as fast as it did and exponentially as it has over the last 30 years. I mean, the explosion of intermodal back in the 90s and sustainability was that all of us moving stuff offshore and moving and becoming a global economy. Well, I think we're maximizing that level. So the idea that we're not growing elsewhere, that's what shows. I mean, the fact that coal has decreased, and I don't know anybody who has a brain who thought that we were going to be using coal as a majority for the rest of our lives, not looking at all different types of fuel resources that were out there that were potentially usable. But again, it's not looking at the future and looking at growth. It's looking at how do we maximize every cent and how do we exploit where we can. And to me, that is the perfect recipe for disaster for the supply chain and the network. It doesn't mean that freight rail will cease to exist. It'll just mean that it'll cease to become relevant in terms of growth and opportunity and how it shapes our national supply chain.
Yeah, it does feel like we witnessed post Staggers and parallel that the shift towards the neoliberal economic model, the offshoring and outsourcing, and also privatization, deregulation, and other, some would call austerity policies as part of neoliberalism. Now we're at a pivotal moment in that paradigm as well. But the system was reshaped to be that sort of superhighway for offshoring and outsourcing and that globalized supply chain. And this idea of reshoring or supply chain resilience or increasing our manufacturing base or having an industrial policy, all of those things, like you've said, they can't really happen without a functional rail system. Our national interest is tied up with the rail system not becoming a further and further diminished infrastructure. Our national interest is intimately tied to a robust, future and reliable, resilient rail system. So what's the pivot? Is the pivot getting a 10% stake in Union Pacific and letting it become a transcontinental railroad with all of the other corruptions? Have that all be suspect because we've got a stake in Union Pacific? That doesn't seem like a way to increase trust or resilience. What do you see? Are there any clear pivots that you would call for?
The clearest pivot, and we talked about it before, is that we need Congress to begin to recognize the importance of freight rail, as you said, in our national, not just our supply chain, but our economy. And not enough members of Congress really, truly understand that. They don't, which is why the board has not been reauthorized since 2015. So it's about 11 years since the board has been reauthorized. When Congress really was operating the way it should have been, it's every 5 years. Whether it's transportation, whether it's ag, whether it's agricultural policy, anything, usually within 5 years, you're going to have a major reauthorization. Disabilities Act, everything. And to say that we've gone literally twice that time and had nothing, even having a major service meltdown, even having the challenge of all these mergers and all these things that have happened, Congress has yet to say, hey, we need to figure this out. There hasn't been a hearing. The service debacle, there was no hearing in Congress dealing with that. So I do lay it at Congress's feet and saying that, look, because the statutes don't allow us, we can't do it all ourselves. We need that help. But we need to be partners with them in terms of what we're going to do. So unless that happens, it's not going to work.
You talked about we don't want the railroads to not make money. And obviously the railroads are making plenty of money. And, the issue of revenue adequacy has been a theme for the ICC and STB. Clearly, revenue adequacy is not a problem. Is there a possibility to put a lid on limits on revenue or limits on share buybacks or require reinvestment? Have the railroads be investing in service and competition and et cetera? Is there a ceiling on revenue? We've talked about revenue adequacy, but might it be useful for there to be a ceiling on revenue?
No, I don't think there should be a ceiling on revenue. I think they should make their money. I just think that there should be the caveat of how you do it with regards to service and growth. At the same time, if we notice that, okay, all your growth is actually in revenue and also through constant rate increases, but we also notice that there's no growth and your shippers are leaving or not being willing to invest more. That's something that I think we should be able to figure out. Because again, I believe our job is not just to regulate. I don't want to regulate. I tell people all the time, I didn't come to regulate. I came to manage the network and hopefully grow the network. Well, how do you grow the network? I would love to get railroads to do it without us regulating it. So it goes back to what I said, if we had a bigger stick to say, hey, if you don't do this, we have the ability to say, hey, we're not going to allow rate increases until we see better performance in service. It incentivizes them to provide better service. To me, the threat of action usually allows action to take place in many instances. It's the old adage when you have kids, my three boys, if they're fighting over the TV, the threat is, okay, if I come down, I will resolve that fight. You won't like it, but the fight will be resolved. Magically, everyone figures out that, oh, okay, well, we don't want that, so we'll figure out how to get along. And I think the same thing in some respects has to be within the freight rail network. Again, I'm not trying to stop them. People always say, oh, the STB is putting up roadblocks. I'm not putting up roadblocks. My job is not to block them. My job is actually to put up guardrails, to keep them consistent and moving in the right direction without going off tangents one way or the other. If I can keep them consistent, I keep service consistent, keep reliability consistent, and keep all these things consistent, not only can they make the money, they can make it while growing their business. And I think that's what we're looking to do.
So along with sticks come carrots. And I wonder if there's a role for the public in regards to investment in dedicated passenger track, potentially electrification of passenger, et cetera, et cetera. So perhaps if there was an adequate stick, actually, I should preface this with, I heard from a railroad planner at UP one time, he said, we'll take public help, but no strings attached. They're like, no strings attached, no strings attached. Well, that's not a very equitable relationship. There's got to be some strings attached. If we're going to be investing in this system, which we have done, and if we're going to be paying the price when they fail to invest in the system, which we are doing, right. We need sticks, but we also need carrots. So I'm wondering about the role of the public and your sense of the potential role of the public in the future of rail. I will also use an example that you can address or not, but I see this commentary about, the difference between trucking and railroads is that trucking can automate and rail is being artificially barred from automation. One, I don't think automation is a really great idea for railroads. I think two-persons crews, when you got these giant trains, is completely reasonable. And honestly, I think the trains should be shorter. And I don't think that's the principal difference between railroads and trucks. I think the principal fundamental difference that seems kind of obvious is that railroads pay for their infrastructure and truckers don't pay for their infrastructure.
I have to say that that's sort of a misnomer. Number one, truckers do pay. We all pay in terms of taxes, in terms of fuel surcharges and fees and all the things, the diesel tax, whatever you want to say, we do pay for those roads. There is a price to pay for access to those roads. There's also a price to pay in a sense that those roads are not all trucks. So it's not like, okay, well, J.B. Hunt pays his taxes, so he gets 95 all to himself, trucks all themselves. Conversely, the NSF has their own line. Yeah, they pay for it, but they share it only when they need to or only when they want to. Their line is their line. the other thing I always challenge people to remember is that most of the railroads that are here today did not pay for that land that they're riding on. And how do I know that? Because if you take, let's say, Elon Musk, who's one of the richest men in the world, he could not start a freight rail business from scratch in this country. It's impossible because he'd have to get permission from whatever states he's going in. Let's say 20 different states. He'd have to get permission to build rail and right of way in those states. And so without federal intervention, preemptive clause, it's impossible. So for everyone to say, well, it's the federal government, I did it all on my own, you really did. You did it because the government gave you land. And they gave you land to build rail. That rail then became what it is today. It wasn't like people went out and bought all that land and did not have preemptive clauses that the STB has to allow you to build track where people don't want you to build track. So let's not say that they did it all their own. Yes, they may pay for it, but government is heavy-handed in allowing you to do that and to run those the way you're allowed to run. And so it's not about necessarily who pays and who doesn't. To me, also, when you look at automation, automated trucks are still way, way off. And the same thing I said previously about trucks, having automated trucks doesn't mean that they have their own automated lane. It means that they're going to be stuck on 95 like everybody else. They're going to be in congestion and traffic like everybody else. It's not going to be this one thing like, oh, there's automated trucks, but they can all run. Yes, they may be able to run throughout the night. From that, I mean, at some point, they're going to have to get gas. You're going to have to figure out how they pump. Because again, unless you're talking about electric trucks, so they don't have those yet, totally. Even an automated truck is going to have to pull over and get diesel fuel. Somebody's going to have to pump it. And so I don't know of a station now that says, okay, yes, I have somebody there waiting to pump automated trucks. So anyway, what I'm saying is it's not going to be the perfect world that people think it's going to be. It isn't. And so the competition will still be there, but it's up to the railroads to actually come into the 21st century to figure out how best to do it. Again, telematics will change a lot. That doesn't mean replacing labor, but it means if you can figure out a sensor on a car that knows where it is everything on it operating the way it should be, is everything safe on a car, all these things, that helps. That helps someone better understand and want to be with rail, as opposed to, I got on a train and they told me I'll be there in 3 days and hopefully it's right. When you call 3 days later, no one knows where the car is.
Right. And there's no accountability. And
well, they don't care because they're making money. I mean, that's the whole thing. They're making money.
And the shipper can't go anyplace else.
Certain shippers, other shippers are going someplace else.
Right.
And I'll just finish it this way. Then comes the problem of growth with those shippers who are stuck on the rail. So if I'm a shipper and I'm captive to that mode of movement and I've got this great product and it has potential to grow, but my rates are growing just as fast, if not faster, on rail. Well, that means it's upping my production costs because I got to pass that along to the end user. Well, at some point, the end user is going to say, I can't pay any more for that product, which means that I can't grow anymore because I'm absorbing so much in transportation costs. It's eating into my profit because I can't sell above a certain price because they're not going to pay that price. And so the economy loses because now, as a company, I can't increase production because it costs too much to transport it. And people don't think along those lines. The cost to producers, to manufacturers, to growers, that no one's going to buy my product if it costs too much for them to purchase. Well, I got to charge that much because it costs more to transport it. So that has to happen for growth to take place. And right now, we are severely out of balance. Right now, like I said, I've talked to organizations and I've talked to industries that said, "Hey, we would love to grow on rail, but we can't because we're not going to spend any more than we're already spending."
Would competition and opening up the infrastructure for other carriers, I think of an open access system, and I know people complain about how open access has or has not worked in Europe. Were these short lines liberated and able to have trackage rights on the class ones, were able to compete for business? Is that potentially a part of the solution of keeping the prices down?
I mean, that would take us into like another hour or so, because I think what I said before is the barriers to entry into railroading is difficult. And you've got all these agreements and trackage rights and others, all these paper barriers out there. You really would have to figure out how we tear all those things down to allow that to happen. I think one of the things that, there's all this autonomous rail that's out there now, or the thought of trying to do it. I think it's interesting. I think it could be groundbreaking, but I also think that maybe in a short line perspective, yes, but it's also impossible to put that on a class one for a long distance haul, because I don't think they would allow moving autonomous vehicles on their when they're moving a 15,000 foot train and you've got two autonomous vehicles in front of you slowing you down or trying to figure out. No, I don't think that would be realistic and how that would happen. Maybe, like I said, short line, there's a possibility, but I think we're unfortunately way beyond that point, where we've got to sort of play with the hand that we currently have and figure out how to make that one work. Open for comment. We can talk more about that, but I think for where we are now, the struggles we have, and as you said, the market dominance and the power that they have, it would take an awful lot to free that.
We do need somehow to shift that power dynamic, though. We need to somehow find a way back towards growth and shift towards the public interest. So having more sticks, doing a surface transportation reauthorization where an educated Congress comes in and advocates and stands up for a stronger railroad system. How do we get from the place we are now to that place in your imagination? How do you see that happening with all of your 35 years of experience on Capitol Hill? How do we get from where we are now to where we want to be?
I would say education and advocacy, biggest things you can do. In order to educate Congress, you have to have an advocacy, not just of shippers and labor and even some short lines. You have to have also the public, like you said, with passenger rail. People need to understand just how important passenger rail is. Most people don't. The majority of people fly still, or they drive. They don't have access. They don't understand the value of it. Of course, they go overseas and they see it and they say, wow, this is fantastic. Why don't we have it here? But they don't educate themselves and understand what the issues are and how strong advocacy gets you to that point. You see it in certain states, places like North Carolina and Virginia, who are increasing their passenger rail service and growing it exponentially. You see it, of course, in the bigger states like California, Illinois with Metra, and the tri-state region, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, the same way. Brightline also is an example of, they're struggling because financially in Florida, again, it's hard to run a railroad. But you see also the high speed that they're developing from California to Nevada and to Vegas. So I think there is an understanding that they'd like it. They just have to understand what it takes and the value of rail. I mean, we've lost it. Once the jet age came in the highways, we thought we don't need trains anymore. Well, most of those generation have moved on, and you've got people who haven't truly grown up utilizing passenger rail the way my parents did, or grandparents, or people in Europe and other places do. And so we've got to, again, get to Congress and get to administration and sell them on the fact that, hey, this is something that needs to be a priority and not something thrown on the back burner. So I think advocacy and education are the two we have to start with.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hope that that advocacy includes the fact that the railroads used to have to provide that service. Yep. And we relieved them of that duty. We did not relieve them of that responsibility to make sure that could still happen.
Absolutely.
And so I think, like you say, there's a lot of educating that has to happen. And your leadership has certainly been important in encouraging people to stand up to the railroads. People are probably wondering where things are at with your challenge to get your position back and your court cases. And so to the extent you want to share that or close with that, or how can people support you and your continued leadership? I know that we at Solutionary Rail, we really appreciate you and really want to be supporting your continued leadership. So what is it that folks could do right now to defend the independence of the agency, but also Mr. Robert Primus?
Well, I think the biggest thing they can do is to, again, educate themselves on what's been going on. Thankfully, I have a legal team that's pro bono, so I don't need financial help. What I need is advocacy in terms of with Congress and with others, underscoring the importance of independent agencies and why they are so needed within the American fabric. I think the more people understand that, the more support that I'll get and others will get too for maintaining, because it's not just my job, it's the agency, it's the independence of the agency. So it's not necessarily, oh, we need to save his job. We need to save the agencies. We need to save the independence of the agencies, the transparency of the agencies, and the ability of the agencies to actually do their job without political interference. If we can do that, I think that's a huge step forward. So right now, pun intended, I'm on two different tracks. We've got the one track that's with the Slaughter case, the FTC case that's currently at the Supreme Court, also Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve. So we're waiting to hear what the Supreme Court, their outcome is going to be. It may be as soon as this week.
Really?
Yeah. The second part, I think, and the more exciting part is myself and Alvin Brown, who was the vice chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board, who was removed. He and I have a joint, not really joint, but we have discrimination lawsuit against the president because not only do we like the Slaughter case removal without cause, we also think it was discriminatory.
Right.
I was the lone Black member of the board and I was the only one removed, even though there was a vacancy at the board. So it wasn't like they needed my seat to create a majority. They did not. My counterpart, Democratic counterpart, her term was expiring at the end of last year. They chose not to target her. Matter of fact, they renominated her. And so the question remains, why was I the only person out? Some people have questioned whether or not it was because I voted against the CPKC merger. The White House said it's America's first, although I tell people, well, I did vote against a Canadian railroad taking over an American railroad. So maybe that's too American for them. And so many other times where I've spoken up for American shippers and jobs and manufacturing. So that case is moving forward. We're waiting for a ruling now. And once the ruling comes, hopefully we'll begin depositions and discovery soon. And I think that will be an excellent chance for me to get my record out as an independent regulator and why I believe that there was discrimination at hand for my removal. During my time on the board, I never spoke up once acknowledging that I was the Black board member or the Black chairman. I didn't ask for the position to be nominated because I want to be the Black nominee. The issue of my background never came up. Only time it came up was when I was removed from the board. And so if that's the case, I'll sort of end here. 63 years ago in DC, Dr. King said that he hoped that his children would be judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Well, I've lived that in Congress. I've lived it up until even today. And the fact that I'm still challenged on that, instead of being considered by my character by this administration, I've been considered by my color. I think that's wrong, and we need to address that.
Absolutely. We need to address that. And your character is unassailable. You have demonstrated such integrity throughout your service. And I don't take it easy on public servants as an activist. So I really appreciate the integrity you've brought. Absolutely. They could have had a fair debate and still controlled a majority on a merger. That had nothing to do with it, obviously. And the pattern that we saw with the series of firings, some people could just take that and shrink away and be bitter and upset, and rightfully so. But you're not doing that. You're standing up and you're accepting your place in history and the fight that has to be fought. And I really appreciate and respect you for that. And I think a lot of people do, even if they're afraid to admit it.
Thanks, Bill.
We wish you the best of luck in that fight, and we'll be cheering for you and advocating to the extent we can. And then we'll be, hopefully after you win that, we'll get you back helping to make decisions for the next paradigm of rail transport to make American rail really actually great.
I would love that. Looking forward to that.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again for your generous time that you spent with us and sharing so openly. I know it's a long time to be on Zoom. So
no, it's good. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert Primus. Much appreciated. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, man.
Take care.
That was former Surface Transportation Board Chair Robert Primus in conversation with Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer. This conversation was edited for clarity and brevity by me, Sasha Elenko. Thank you to Oda Proda for the theme music. You can find this show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.